welcome to Fluid Conversations, a platform where we invite global thought leaders and influencers to talk on issues pertaining from the natural environment all the way through to economics and finance. This platform is brought to you by your host, Mr. Dhesigen Naidoo, who is the current CEO of the Water Research Commission, President of the Human Rights to Water. He is a founding member of the Water Policy Group and a fellow at the Mapungubwe Institute of Strategic Reflection. Should you want to engage with any of our panelists or our host, please feel free to engage directly with them through their organizations or through their social media tags, which will be available on the screen. Without any further ado, over to you, Dhesigen.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. We have, as usual, a really interesting guest today. The person I'm going to introduce to you just now is an academic of note, particularly in the domain of innovation and science and technology systems. He has a litany of academic fellowships. He is visiting an extraordinary professor in some very powerful academic institutions all over the world. He holds many leadership positions in those environments. He is the South African chair of the SA node of the Millennium Project, and he is a very important part of South African history. In fact, he was the national coordinator for the Science and Technology Transition Project of South Africa's first democratic government, an architect of the modern South African national system of innovation, and founding director of the Institute for Economic Research and Innovation, IRI, at the Tshwane University of Technology. I am, of course, talking about Rasigan Mahajh. Rasigan, good morning to you.
Good morning, Dhesigen.
Rasigan, let's just kick off. 2008, a little bit of time ago, saw the end of what's one of the pundits in this part of the world, Clem Santa, called the long boom. And by all accounts, we haven't really recovered yet. We have a continuous global economic crunch for all of these 12 years. How do you read it? What were the factors involved? Why are we having such difficulty getting out of it?
So thanks very much, Dhesigen, and thanks for framing the question in the way in which you did as well. You know, a perception of us experiencing negative conditions is usually the result of us understanding what the positive conditions should be. So in other words, it is a counterfactual to argue that we are in a crisis. If, however, we understand the world systems that we are part of themselves to be consistent with contradictions that continuously generate crises, and we look at our real history over our long evolutionary past, we'll realize that unlike Clem Santa, what we are experiencing is the normal existence for most of humanity. Yeah. We are now starting to see it in maybe a more distributed form. So in other words, those parts of the world system that had higher levels of capabilities and capacities now find that their competence to respond to systemic challenges themselves are being challenged. And so that's quite an important point in differentiating. We should not be shocked. We should not be surprised. Yeah? Either about the financial crisis of 2007-8 or the current syndemic called COVID-19. These are all things that we had warnings of. Our inability to mobilize and organize ourselves to respond to it is what should surprise us. And that speaks to a failure, a massive failure in the participation, inclusion, and democratic processes. That's what we need to really confront.
That's an important analysis, and I think most people will agree with you. But you two will agree, though, that there seems to be far less currency floating around the world, that far fewer enterprises are now being developed than they were during this time of relative prosperity, and many, many more people out of work compared to what we have seen before. I mean, this is a really genuine economic challenge in the world. Is that not true?
Absolutely. No, I hope in my initial response, it did not come across that I was making it out that this was trivial. No, this is significant. But the significance also lies in the fact that as a pattern, it's been repeating itself since 1771. This is the point I'm trying to put across. So, I wanted to, in terms of responding to the point you had made, an analysis of the global economic crunch since 2008. And it's not possible, this is what I'm suggesting, that to understand this just as an episode in and of itself. It's part of a much larger soap opera that we are all inside, that has started a long time before it. And so what we see in 2008, 2007/8, is only an element that breaks the surface. And because of a very incorrect response to that crisis, it was never resolved. The consequence of it, when you speak about not enough currency being around, so I'm assuming we're talking about money itself. In terms of money, it is a social product. There isn't a money in a natural world. It's a way in which we recognize value. So to that, my response is completely negative. What stock of value we've created is very unevenly distributed, and because of that, in areas where there's higher need for it, you have less of it. So this itself is the result of deliberate policy and other transformations that have happened over a period of time. It is not something that you... I'm trying to also contrast out this, a very important criticism that we have of the way people are thinking of the economy. The economy is not the household. When we're talking of national economies and world systems, it is not the same as you in a home organizing your monthly budget. The thing that we are forgetting is the sovereign instrument which creates money is the very political entity called government. So you can imagine how strange this is as a political economist to hear from someone that there's not enough money. You have to ask, why didn't the government make more money? It's a simple answer to it.
Because one of the things that we've just been through, and we are still going through actually, this COVID pandemic, has in fact laid bare many things to us. I mean, it's just opened up the packaging and said, this is the reality inside. And one of those realities inside is that we have, as you put it, and I'm using different words now, we have an unsustainable economic model that we operate on.
Absolutely.
So does this analysis say to us that maybe with this knowledge that we now have, with this knowledge given to us, if you like, by the COVID crisis, because it forced us all to be together in this conversation, do we now have the possibility to engage and design a more sustainable economic model in the world?
So I would respond hugely positively and say this has enhanced the possibility of our response. However, the structural and systemic constraints on participation and inclusion also coexist. So we've not removed those means through which people are excluded. And because that exclusion, the sort of strength of the exclusionary measures persist, we really do need a much stronger way of integrating what we want from the future and correlating that with the very things that prevent us from achieving it. A simple way, again, talking about the economy in its broadest sense. Currently, no measure of what's produced nationally and aggregated globally accounts for the cost of social reproduction. All of our numbers speak about what we produce in factories or on using technologies itself for exchange. But the very capacity of ourselves to survive and have a life is not included. That becomes unpaid work. And we know who bears the burden of the majority of unpaid work in the world, and consequently, patriarchy remains unchallenged. So I hope through that example, I've also explained the way in which we measure what is economic activity itself has huge imperfections built into it. This opportunity that we have now, if we choose to do more than just reform, allows us to transform and bring into the equation the real costs of existing precariously on a planet with its own metabolism that we have yet to reconcile ourselves to.
Perfect. Well, let me get a chance to put an economics professor on the spot. Yes, it is a very imperfect world. We've done some really bad things to get to where we are. Let me put it to you then. If you had to design what this new economy should look like going forward, what would be the key features that will build up this new, more sustainable system?
So an immediate and real possibility emerges us for embracing the fact that we are the last extent of our species being. We are but humans. Homo sapiens sapiens. And I really consider us having to remove at least one of the sapiens from our name, because I don't think we are as clever as we think we are. So the wisdom issue is being brought up, teasing on that. But a more important point that I would raise in response to this is adopting the fact that we do now know more about our situation. And as you pointed out, we also have a sense of what it is that's required to sustain life. We've had extensive work done by, amongst others, the Stockholm Resource Institute, TELUS, a whole range of institutions concerned with the environment, providing to us the parameters by which we can measure our impact on the geophysical system that we are engaging with. Because of that, we can also determine what are the safe operating parameters within which, human life is possible. Not only human life, all life is possible. So that then can give us a sense of at least budgetary constraints. We know how much of emissions we can afford to continue to put into the atmosphere. This doesn't mean we have to operate on maximum and hope for the best. We should be looking at removing those things that pollute our environment and opening up the possibilities of us being able to live a life that's resilient to the changes that we have already brought upon ourselves. So it's quite important, this difference between green fields and brown fields. Our green field is a brown field. So in other words, where we are starting from is a bit of a polluted mess that we've created, but it's of our making. As much as it's of our making, we can also contribute to redressing the systems that we've brought into this precarious relationship with ourselves. So redressing that metabolic rift is paramount in a new paradigm. In other words, reconciling ourselves as but one form of life on a planet with at least 5 other kingdoms of different life forms. COVID-19 as a virus is one of those other forms of life. So we must always remember this, Dhesigen. COVID is not fighting us. We need to protect ourselves against it and other zoonotic transfers of its ilk. To do that, we have to do more to not keep invading the space of the other species on the planet, other life forms on the planet. Our destruction of biodiversity is one of the strongest correlates with the type of precariousness we've opened ourselves to. And it includes our hell-bent sort of death wish of commodifying all of life, including air, water, and various forms of sustenance. So that's the third plank of that. We have to re-look what constitutes the common goods and services that are required for life and reappropriate it into a social system. We cannot continue privatizing and outsourcing things that we are absolutely dependent on for being alive. As you know, the placing water futures based on risks onto stock exchanges is a very slippery slope. I'm sure most of us joked when we saw Arnold Schwarzenegger take off his helmet on another planet, where you have to pay per dose of oxygen. Yeah. Now, we know Schwarzenegger is just in another state in the US, but we are facing the same future right here of us having to pay for units of oxygen. It's a very so I would think, at least in terms of those three planks, being able to reconcile the metabolic rift, relocate ourselves as amongst others constituting the living elements of this planet, and then removing those components that drive us to aberrant behavior that's antithetical to our existence as a species. All of these subdivisions, gender, race, identities of a variety of sorts, etc., are just used to make more complicated systems of oppression and subjugation. Yeah. Setting that aside means that as a species being, we have the possibility, working together as global citizens on a planet for its protection. We protect it, it protects us. We have a few billion years left before this planet comes to the end of its cycle, hopefully. And during that time, we should pay more attention to make it work for us.
Thank you. That's quite insightful. And I'm sure it's going to disturb a whole bunch of people. I think most people accept this notion, well, some people accept this notion of planetary boundaries. There are some people who accept that somebody's talking about planetary boundaries and are pursuing what they need to do anyway. What I want to know is that what you describe, and I'll be one of those Homo sapien, sans sapien myself, it's just too far to get to. It is a good ideal, but what are the practical building steps to get there? And starting from this murky brown field that we currently have, what are the baby steps to start moving to that?
So, as you put it across, there's much in our environment that argues against finding such benign possibilities, or a progressive possibility. But we have the biggest lived experiment in our world system. The largest single country has managed to achieve much of what we are saying the rest of us cannot. And they've done that through effectively planning and coordinating what happens in their society. And that's the biggest import that we all need to embrace. Leaving it vaguely to those that have benefited from slavery, colonialism, imperialism, monopoly capitalism, post-colonial compradorship, and the neoliberalism we now are in, offers us no hope. But a socialized and coordinated future is possible, and we can even organize ourselves in terms of those planetary boundaries to operate within it. Yeah? None of us, on the basis of what we've accumulated from the sins of our ancestors, should be the basis of our further privileges.
Okie dokie. Then let me push you a little bit further in this direction. Because one of the problems with the world as we currently have it is very skewed patterns of production and consumption. I'm assuming that in the formula that you're putting out, you're talking about much more equity with regards to that. But I want to get a little bit patriotic about home. In this new formula around the way we design a global economy, is there the possibility of a bit of a special place for this very underdeveloped continent, Africa, and our own country, South Africa?
Yeah. Absolutely. There's more than a little place. There's a big place. We are going to be the most populous territory of the planet, whether the rest of the planet likes it or not. It's an inevitability built into our demographic transition. So the rest of the planet has got to come to terms with how Africa enters this world system on the basis of a dominance age-wise. The rest of the world may be too old to produce anything, whereas we have the capability and capacity to do that. So that embrace needs to take place as well. Yeah. And maybe, if you don't mind, I can twist something and you can see how you can put it into a better format. If we now claim the receipts in Africa for all of the Stone Age technologies that allowed humanity to occupy the rest of the planet, we don't have to be worried about being at the back of the queue for current vaccines. None of the rest of the planet has paid for the stone axe that was developed a few kilometers from where both of us are sitting.
That's a really good point. That's a really refreshing view. But let me pursue this stuff, though.
I hope it wasn't too.
I'll come back to this African question. I really like the way that you phrased that. One of the key features of our current unwise way in which we operate as human beings is embedding a wealth gain model in inequality. Yeah? And we are at this time more unequal as a world than we have ever been. As a country, I think we're number 2 on the list of being most unequal in the world. What is that prognosis for a better global and an improved local inequality? Is this really possible with these baby steps that you're talking about?
So, the reason for the combined yet uneven distribution of capacities, capabilities, and competences is because of the systems through which they are transacted. Yeah? So the way in which different parts of the world were incorporated into the world system also locked them into what we can call an international division of labor. The consequence of that is it prefigured and it established a lock-in in terms of those with advantages, accelerating the advantages, and those advantages being paid for out of the expropriation and exploitation of the others. So there is no first industrial revolution in Western Europe if there was no slavery and colonization taking place in the rest of the world. It's on the basis of the incorporation of that that allowed for those developments to take place and advanced production to be put in place. Yeah. So I mean, a good way of seeing this, Dhesigen, because we should work in reality. So our facts need to shape our theories, not our theories telling us what our facts are. That's another way in which you lock out thinking. Yeah. So I'm sure you would realize this. We've all been to England quite a bit. We are speaking English at present, dressed in English apparel, to say the least. Yeah. Yes, it's a really tragic story in terms of what this represents. Because the people that occupied the island territory that we know as the United Kingdom were mainly wearing woolen clothes. Cotton hadn't featured in their wardrobes, but there was a thriving cotton-centered clothing industry on a subcontinent in Asia. It held nearly 25% of world output before the British arrived and colonized it. At the end of that period, India's share was less than 3%. So this wanton destruction of productive capabilities, shapes this thinking of zero-sum games, where a single entity gains and everyone else loses. And we need not have that system. We should be mature enough to realize our object is not individual aggrandization or wealth accumulation. We need to come to grips with, again, that the only planned system in the world that's working at present, its future prospect at the end of the cycle of 5-year plans is moderate prosperity for all. It's not billionaires as quickly as you can count them. So this way of thinking is also important because the majority of the world's population do not occupy those citadels of power where such individuals rule the roost. And we need to call that back in. A very strong contrast available to us immediately in one of the proposals thinking about the future is a universal basic income grant. So, of course, some of the more conservative, or I would say rather unthinking responses to it is, whoa, how can you give people money for nothing? Well, can I ask anyone to give me the answer of how inheritance works? And how is it that an individual that accumulated wealth is able to transfer that across a generation with no labor being expended? I'm raising that to give you a sense, Dhesigen. We need to rethink a lot of what we assume to be convention and acceptable. We are reproducing inequality by what we are doing. That's what needs to break.
Perfect. Thank you for that. But I will remind you of something that might be uncomfortable. That trajectory of India and its cotton industry, while stimulated by the imperialist power, found several resonant souls in India itself that saw the opportunity for monopoly and the chance to make a lot of money. And some of those individuals, I have to point out, are celebrated nowadays as the architects of the modern Indian economy.
There you go.
This is the way the narrative works. But let me push you in one more direction. You've started talking about this already, around there being not just room for a green growth model. You're actually saying that a green growth model is the center of a sustainable system. And it gave me some wonderful flashbacks of the World Summit on Sustainable Development back in 2002, where we as a collective really put this out to the global community as a potential formula to engage. It was engaged theoretically. Some of those clauses are still in what is called the Johannesburg Plan of Action.
Declaration. I'm aware of it.
But we have implemented none of that. So what is going to be different this time around? Is it the much clearer thinking that we have, having now been in the middle of a crisis and knowing what the consequences are in a way that we cannot ignore anymore? Are there going to be other drivers around the system that helps us in this direction?
Well, I think it's very important you mentioned WSSD, because it's a crucial element of our sustainability discourse that actually doesn't feature in the mainstream anymore. And that's a question we need to be asking. We speak about the COPs, we speak about the agreements, etc., but we've forgotten about our intended, not intended national contributions, but our actual intention policy-wise to harmonize ourselves around sustainability. So why was that removed? And that's why you can't exclude the other elements of what's influencing our way of thinking. At the same time as WSSD was taking place, you must remember it follows on the Millennium Assessment, it follows on what we were then operating on MDGs, Millennium Development Goals. And people may not recognize this because it was also one of our own. It was an African who was the Secretary General of the United Nations during that time. But what were we embracing? A global compact between transnational corporations financiers, and politicians. I want to suggest that that holds some of the reasons why we do not have an implementation of what was agreed to by politicians, but did not meet the interests of transnational corporations and financiers on a global scale. It's coming back to us. The World Economic Forum has not forgotten that and is continuing to steer us in such directions presently. Yeah? We cannot reform a system whose object is the separation of people from what they produce. That's the object of capitalism. There cannot be a benign capitalism. In the same way, Dhesigen, as you know, you have a natural science degree. How is it possible to factor in infinite inside a finite? There is no possibility of growth being perpetuated when the results of growth to date have been an uneven distribution of its benefits. We need to stop the issue around growth and look at, from what we have, how we have better systems of accessing. In other words, I'm suggesting we need to be thinking about degrowth in terms of our developmental model as well, an active practice of degrowth.
That's going to trouble a lot of people. Let me challenge you with something. As Homo sapien optimista, if we look at some of the statistics in the world, I mean, we're now sitting in an arena where the fastest growing car manufacturer in the world is Tesla, right, on a green growth platform. Most of the major production lines of vehicles in the world have an electricity vehicle line, and it is usually the fastest growing one within them. The fastest growth of the energy industry in the world as a whole is around renewables. This must be one subset of indication that there is a tacit appreciation, maybe with different perspectives, of what you've been talking about, and the possibility of really empowering a green model for the global economy. Can it not?
I'm fully supportive of the green model. I'm suggesting to you, please exclude the word growth in it. We need a green developmental model. That's all. You see, Dhesigen, just think back in time. We went through a similar transition more than a century ago, except we weren't active agents in that transition. The first automobile ran on an electric drive system. It did not drive on an internal combustion engine. The discovery of oil, the colonization of the Middle East, the destruction of Palestine, etc., follows. And the consequences of that is a petrochemical industry that drove automobiles. These are choices we made. And we even knew there was evidence from that time about the ecological problems that would follow from it. Burning fossil fuel and what happens to the particulates. So I raise that in a similar way. Institutions such as Water Research Council, all of our science-generating institutions, should be putting more and more of these facts into the public domain. We should not countenance any naysaying to it from either political or commercial interests. In fact, it's difficult to see the line between political and commercial interests because of their complicity and the corruption that surrounds us at present. So the only way we can confront it is more facts, and more facts understood by people and appreciated in the way in which we are doing now, and then encouragement of using those facts to determine policy. It's very important, this notion about being evidence-based. You can also be evidence-biased. And the evidence-biased is using your prejudices from the past to determine what future possibilities exist. We have to get past those implicit biases by making them explicit. So we cannot continue, and you know this from the South African Council for Planning. I gave a keynote address when I was being transported down to the venue, which is in Cape Town Convention Center. Yeah, it was terrible Cape Town weather. You mentioned this at the start. Raining, gray, yeah, as we're driving down the very long street that comes down that sharp incline, past the Human Sciences Research Council building, heading down to, we see bright lights and people huddled outside these bright lights. There were whole families sleeping rough in the light that came out of a motor vehicle display entity we had put into safe and secure surroundings. A car, and outside on the street in front of the car was a family. We cannot continue such choices into the future. It's a deliberate choice. I hope I'm putting this across with the strength in which it needs to go across. Yeah? Because that same municipality then imposed fines on people for sleeping without a house or residence. Does it not strike the politicians that the reason people are on the street is because of their lack of resources? Fining them does not improve their situation. Affording them, a sustainable shelter is a possibility out. So I really think, again, when we come down to basics, we will find that the choices that we've made have deliberately taken us down a pathway. And that pathway is what's generated the huge inequities around us. You had posed a question earlier. As an economist itself, or as you know, I don't like using that. As someone who studies the political economy, I can see without chance of being contradicted, humanity, since our rise almost 13 million years ago, our split from our other great apes, they maintained the greatness. We just became apes of the hominid type. Because they have dignity as well. You don't find a gorilla allowing another gorilla to be outside a Mercedes-Benz dealership, trying to scrounge out an existence. I'm sorry, I'm going. The point I was trying to make around that, is since those 13 million years ago, we have improved our productivity. And I mean this in a very nasty, narrowly framed way. Relative to our inputs, we can create many more outputs. That's a productivity measure itself. So our cognitive capacity has also improved. All of these tools available to us allow us to analyze a huge amount of data that was not possible before. We, in fact, generate a lot more data today than ever before in our history. Making sense of that, however, is not easy, So it's quite important then, in terms of all of this information available to us, to be able to use that towards purposes that are progressive, that are in favor of people and the future. If we follow what you've said earlier, we can resign ourselves to a very simple fact. The planet has existed for, 4.54 billion years. We're in a universe at least 13.8 billion years. Our existence as Homo sapiens sapien is 300,000. You don't need to put in the log scale to work out. We are a blip in its history. The history will continue without us. If we choose to continue, we have to redress these social choices that we've made that are, facilitating our suicidal tendency.
But you're also saying, Professor Rasigan Mahajh, that there is hope. The data is available. We have a chance to build the kind of model that really makes sense. We can organize ourselves into a just green transition. And maybe most importantly, we can regain and earn our name as Homo sapiens sapien. Colleagues, we have been in an insightful discussion with Professor Rasigan Mahajh, and I'm sure we're going to return to him in due course and challenge him further on unpacking what this model can mean. Rasigan, thank you so much for your time.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the opportunity. hope this has been sufficiently challenging, and we can derive some benefit from it. Yeah.